We are going to start our forum for today. Officially now, I want to welcome all and everybody who's here right now, and thank you for your support. And we're going to have, um, let's go and have the agenda right now. The ground rules first. Thank you, Julie. As usual, mute your mic, raise your hand to speak. Remember, the hand is, if you press the chat icon, you will see there your an icon of a hand. Please press it if you want to speak. Be brief on your comment or your question. Be respectful to others. Question ideas, not people. Practice active listening. Make I statements rather than generalize we statements. And now, with that said, let's go to the agenda. Our next point is the documentary about the Chicano Moratorium. I have to say, this is a video that actually was in a can, sort of speaking, for almost 40 years, 30 years, because it came to light just 10 years ago. In August 29th this year, it was the commemoration of the 50th anniversary of the Chicano Moratorium. We're gonna, after the documentary, we're gonna go to the breakout rooms. There's two questions that I would like for you to keep in mind. And then, as we did in the past, we're gonna come back, and I have a couple of questions for our guest, which is Dr. Ortiz. Some of you already know him. If not, we're gonna do the introduction later. And we're open to general questions. So if you have a question while you are watching the documentary, please write it down, and we can start with your questions instead of the ones that I already have prepared. And then we're going to touch a little bit and talk about what we are going to have for the next Friday, next week, which will be the last in the closing of the Hispanic Heritage Month activities. With all this, once we go into the documentary, I want to make a note for all of you. Unfortunately, the sound of the documentary is low. So please adjust your settings accordingly, up the volume a little bit, because the volume of the documentary is kind of low. So there's nothing wrong with the signal or with the video, it's just the quality that it is. So please adjust properly your settings, and let's take a look at the video.
Are we seeing it?
Yes.
Okay.
I am Chicano. I am born for the blood of the Spanish sword and the Indian temple. I am from Arizona, Colorado, Nuevo Mexico, Texas y California. Soy de Aztlán. My grandfather gazed over our fields and watched the stallion roam. The Anglo came not to live as brothers, but as masters. The people of the sun revolted, but were silenced by the gun. Now the winds of Aztlán echo cries of hunger. Now the blood of my brothers flows over the land once ours. I am Chicano. My people are La Raza. Too many Chicanos have died in foreign jungles. Too many have died in barrio streets. Ya, basta. Yo soy Chicano.
This is a moratorium. This is for La Raza. Yes, for us, and for the world to see. Because today is a day of history for all of La Raza, wherever they are. Throughout Latin America, throughout Mexico, wherever brown people exist, today is a day of history. And from this day on, La raza mexicana shall be history.
Chicanos are marching to protest the high casualty rate of our people in Vietnam. We have suffered 22% of all casualties in Vietnam, yet we only make up 5% of the total population here in the United States. Our moratorium are saying now that the front line for Chicano youth is not in Vietnam, but in the struggle for social justice here in the barrios of the United States.
Before, the people were divided very much, especially during the Pachuco days. Chicano would be fighting Chicano. Now I see unity. Like now you can go from one barrio to another and you're brothers. And this is really beautiful to see people united and fighting for the same cause.
The Brown Berets evolved out of the movement in the Chicano community for social justice. The Brown Berets are a community organization that give new pride to Chicano youth and that educate all the people in the barrios on their social and political rights. Of over 20,000 people in the march, more than 7,000 remained to listen to música and speeches from various Chicano community leaders.
We are a bronze people with a bronze culture. Before the world, before all of North America, before all our brothers on this the bronze continent, we are a nation. We are a union of free pueblos. We are Aztlán. Cuando me dicen que a revolución defiendo a mi raza con mucho.
A block east of the north end of the park, there is a liquor store. A few people were walking out of the store without paying for their merchandise. Somebody called the police.
The younger kid came back with the police, 2 more squad cars. They pulled up right together, and they were the ones that they had their sirens and the lights. Another car pulled up, and all the police that were across the street had shotguns. And right then and there, I saw bottles.
At this point, there was a small crowd of people reacting to the overpresence of the police. The police had a choice of coming to the platform, using our mic, and asking our Chicano leaders to calm the situation, or to bring in reinforcements and to clear the whole park. Their answer was quick and without hesitation.
Soy diferente, soy color café.
I ran because I'm afraid of the police. I met a lady about 63 years old, and I told her, I said, move because the police are coming. The lady wanted to see. So I went to the first house, and I stood at the porch there, and a police officer came and beat her up with a baton on the head, and that lady just went out like a rag. So then I started yelling, so they wouldn't beat no more because 2 or 3 officers and sometimes 6 would get a boy and they were beating him up. And then they would go and get somebody else. And some of them, they would take them away. But that lady, they just left her there.
okay? We're not against anyone, against the black people or the white people. We're against the pigs. We're against oppression. Our organization, our peoples, is being raised in the white person's mind as a stereotype. How the hell are we going to grow up and become anything if the white people keep pushing into our minds that we're nothing but a bunch of Frito banditos, okay? We're a bandito, well, a bandito's go to jail, okay? Right, in Norco, the narcotics hospital in Corona, okay, there's almost 80% Chicanos. You know that? You know why? Because the Chicanos are trying to escape from their environment. They aren't satisfied. They can't dig it. They can't live in this environment. We cannot live in this environment. The white people have given it to us, and we cannot survive in it. We either have to go to jail or have to die. We're ready to die to get out of it.
Ruben Salazar, a Chicano newspaper and television writer who more than anyone else had accelerated the unifying forces in the community, sought shelter in a local bar.
And I was coming this way, and 3 shots came. Then I hit the floor, and when I hit the floor, Mr. Salazar was falling down, and I looked at him, and he was shaking.
You might not live in the barrio, but I've been here since, let's say, since the 40s or whatever. I believe that if they're not going to listen, this thing's going to come on again, and it's going to continue until there's a change, because kind words aren't going to change it anymore.
I want to apologize for the not very good quality of the video and the sound, but among all the documents and videos that I saw online, this one really kept my attention because of the images, the raw of the images that we were seeing, and I wanted to share that with you. Anyhow, let's go to the breakout rooms. But before we do that, let's see the poll. And let's see the results. Let's see, 25%, 57% say 34, 11% said 40, and 32% responded 30 to the question, how many state legislators in California are Latino? Those who responded 34 are correct. There are 27 in representatives and 7 senators Latinos in the state of California. So now let's go and, okay, here it is. Oh, I can't get it out of my screen. Okay, now let's go to the breakout rooms, and I want for you to consider the following questions for discussion. What do you take from the video, from the images? Personally, I saw a very pacific march, and then all of a sudden violence erupted. I don't know from where. If the violence was initiated by the police or the protesters. What were the reasons that brought 2,000 Chicanos to the streets of East LA? And I think this has been, okay, well, we're back from the breakout rooms, and I hope you had a good session. The questions that we were suggested for discussion was, what did you take from the video? What were the reasons that brought 20,000 Chicanos to the streets of LA? I will ask for the next slide, please. And we're gonna go into question and answer point now, and let's see just the question and answer etiquette. Anyone can ask a question, just follow the next steps. Place your question in the chat room, please. Raise your hand. You will see the icon once you click the chat room icon. Then you will see the hand. Click on the hand, and then we'll see it. You can type your question or wait until we call your name and then ask the question. Once you ask the question, briefly introduce yourself, ask the question, unmute, then back mute your mic. And well, I forgot, unmute your mic. So you can briefly introduce yourself and ask the question and then mute back your mic. Basically, this is, okay, we have a first question. Dr. Ortiz, in the one of the breakout rooms, they had, they want to know, they said, Claudia Diaz says, good afternoon, everybody. This might be an obvious question, but in our group, we were curious about how this event ended.
Well, as we saw in the documentary, the event ended with the dispersal of all those who had been at the protest. They, many of them ran through the neighborhood as they were being tear gassed and trying to find refuge wherever they could. And, there were, I think, 200 who were arrested. 3 people ended up being killed. And the most prominent person killed was the LA Times journalist, Rubén Salazar. And it was a traumatic event that's still being discussed. And we just celebrated the 50th anniversary of that moratorium. And the activism continued after the moratorium, but it assumed new forms. People tried to draw lessons from the moratorium. So maybe let me offer some contextual comments and then we can continue with the questions. First, in terms of my own personal connection to the moratorium, I wasn't at the moratorium, but I had, when I was an undergraduate, I was an activist in Texas with an organization called the Mexican American Youth Organization. And in Texas, Mayo spearheaded the Chicano anti-war movement in Texas. And so I was involved in the protests and demonstrations that were organized by Mayo. And the anti-war movement was larger here in California than in Texas, but it did exist. And so Mayo again spearheaded those efforts. I had a personal connection to what was occurring in Vietnam in as much as when I was in my senior year in high school, like other Chicanos, felt that I didn't have many opportunities, didn't really understand college or what might be available in college and so on. So I actually came very close to joining the Marine Corps with my best friend, whose name was Roberto Mendez. But on the day we were to enlist, I decided that I would try my chances doing other things other than join the Marines. He enlisted and was killed in Vietnam in October of 1968. And that was, for me, that was a personally traumatic experience, seeing, knowing that he had died in Vietnam. I had also had 2 cousins who had been involved, had been drafted into the war, and both of them came back from Vietnam severely traumatized by what they underwent. So I lost my best friend. I saw my cousin severely traumatized, and I began to question the war, having understood that part of what was happening was that we were being lied to about the course of the war. Those of you who were around back in the day may recall that we kept hearing that we were winning the war, when in fact that wasn't true. And it came to light, especially in 1968, when the Tet Offensive occurred. And then Walter Cronkite went to Vietnam and interviewed officers and rank and file military and others, and comes back to the United States and reports that the war was not winnable. And so all that kind of was influencing me. And so ultimately, besides all those events, my own religious upbringing as a Catholic had inclined me towards pacifism. So what ends up happening is, after the moratorium, given what occurs on that day and what I see occurring, I decided that I would resist the war personally by continuing the protest with Mayo, but I also applied for conscientious objector status under selective service. So at this time, back in 1970, I was working on my application for conscientious objector status. So I submitted the application, and finally in April of 71, I was actually awarded conscientious objector status. It was not something that I did lightly because there was fear, for example, on my father's part, that by doing so, I was going to be blacklisted or blackballed, because in Texas, you simply didn't do that. You were supposed to be a patriot and volunteer for the military. But I chose again to resist by declaring myself as a conscientious objector. So I received the conscientious objector, but I'd never served because my number never came up in the lottery at the time that we had that mandatory draft. But I've continued my anti-war activism. So today, 50 years later, I'm a member of the board of an organization called Project Llano. Llano stands for Youth in Non-Military Opportunities. So what we do is we work on counter recruitment, and we try to educate youth about the opportunities that are available that do not involve serving in the military. So this goes back to what I experienced and what the Chicano anti-war movement helped to see me see in that era. And the Chicano Moratorium, as Ricardo pointed out at the beginning, was the largest protest of the Chicano movement. Over 20,000 people turned out. The second largest protest occurred in 1968 in East Los Angeles, when over 10,000 students walked out of the schools in East Los Angeles in protest of the conditions in those schools. Okay.
Dr. Ortiz, I'm sorry, we have another question.
Yes.
Pertinent to what you're, Randall, would you like to ask a question to Professor Ortiz?
Yes.
Yes, Professor, I was just wondering if this was a unique event, or was this one of many protests or riot situations?
No, so it was one of a series of protests against the war. And in terms of the issue of the riot, looking back, people who were there at that day, and even now historians, they say that that day was actually the day the police rioted, that it wasn't those who organized the marches we saw. It was the violence was triggered by the police proceeding into the crowd and trying to break up the rally. And as we saw, it became very vicious. And so before that, there had been a series of protests, both in East LA and other parts of the Southwest, and all of them had been peaceful, okay? And so this was not only the major protest, but also where we saw the brutal repression of peaceful protest. So before I forget, so there's a UC connection to the moratorium. And so at the beginning of the documentary, you heard the data about the disproportionate rate of casualties in Vietnam. That data was provided in a study done by Dr. Ralph Guzman. I think there's a picture of Dr. Guzman I had submitted. No, the next picture?
No, the next picture, okay.
The next picture, yes. The next photo, yes. Yes, on the left, that's Dr. Ralph Guzman. Dr. Guzman was the first Chicano to earn a doctorate degree in political science. He earned a degree at UCLA, and he did a study of casualties in Vietnam. And it was his study whose findings were reported. And what he concluded was that Chicanos were dying at a disproportionate rate. We made up, 22% of the casualties, yet at that time, we only made up 5% of the population. So his study actually catalyzed the Chicano anti-war movement. Before that study, we sensed that there was something amiss, but it was hard to get our hands on anything tangible that could prove what we were feeling in terms of the casualties that were occurring in Vietnam. And Dr. Guzman study provides that data, and it was very convincing data. Dr. Guzman, so he earned his PhD at UCLA. He later became professor of politics at UC Santa Cruz. He also served in the Carter administration as undersecretary for Latin American affairs. He was an immigrant from Mexico who had grown up in Mexico and then came across the border, was educated in this country, and ends up making this very significant contribution in terms of this study that again serves as a catalyst. Historians looking back say that without his study, it's highly unlikely that we probably would have seen the surge of the Chicano anti-war movement. Now on the right in the photo, the young man holding the microphones, his name is Rosalio Muñoz. At the time he's involved in this protest, he happened to be president of the student body at UCLA. Okay. He was one of a handful of Chicano students admitted to the UCLA and indeed the entire UC system in the 1960s. And so at UCLA, he had gathered with other of the Mexican American students there and formed an organization called the United Mexican American Students. He was involved in the protests against the schools in '68, was politicized through that experience. And so he decides to run for student body president at UCLA, and he wins, becoming the first Chicano to ever serve as student body president at UCLA. And he ran on a platform calling for an end to the war in Vietnam, the drafting of young people, call for disarming the campus police. So think of, if you want to know whose brainchild was the Chicano Moratorium, people would say it was Rosalio Muñoz's brainchild. Without him and without Dr. Guzman's study, there may not have ever been a Chicano Moratorium.
So that's a huge connection with the UC system.
Yes, without them, there wouldn't have been that largest protest. And the Chicano anti-war movement would not certainly have surged to the level that it did.
Wow.
So you can see the connection between the research and the activism, and then how holding a position in student government, allowed him to have a platform to be able to articulate and help further promote the movement. So there was a second question or another question?
Yes, well, basically, I was, going through the breakout rooms. Someone mentioned that, especially the younger generations, do not really fully comprehend or understand the Chicano movement.
Yes.
Who is Chicano? What is the Chicano movement?
Okay, so
is the Chicano movement still alive?
Yeah, so the Chicano movement was one of several social movements that emerged in the 1960s. And the movement's beginning chronologically is said to be 1965, which is when Cesar Chavez and the farm workers launched the grape strike in the San Joaquin Valley and inspired young people all throughout California and the rest of the Southwest. So those who created the Chicano movement had come to identify as Chicanos. Chronologically speaking, we were part of the so-called boomer generation. And most of us were born between 1944 and 1964, had undergone all the experiences of growing up to the period, like the assassinations of John F. Kennedy, all of the civil rights, seeing the civil rights movements. And so you have this upsurge, this social movement that is called the Chicano movement, because again, the people who have created it are identifying as Chicanos. So in the documentary, we heard reference to Rubén Salazar. Rubén Salazar was the first journalist hired by the Los Angeles Times. He became quite prominent nationally because of his writing, and much of his writing and coverage was about Mexican Americans in Los Angeles and elsewhere. As we heard in the documentary, he became a martyr. He was killed. There was a lot of speculation as to whether he had been targeted, because much of his writing had come to be very critical of the Los Angeles Police Department, the Los Angeles sheriffs. And so there was this suspicion that in fact his death hadn't been accidental, that in fact he had been targeted by authorities. In any case, one of his most famous columns for the LA Times was called "What is a Chicano and what do the Chicanos want?" And in this column, he tried to make sense of what it is the Chicanos were after. And so as part of it, he says, some Mexican Americans might ask, why can't we just call ourselves Americans? And he wrote, quote, Chicanos are trying to explain why not. Mexican Americans, though indigenous to the Southwest, are on the lowest rung scholastically, economically, socially, and politically. Chicanos feel cheated. They want to effect change now. Mexican Americans average 8 years of schooling compared to Negroes, 10 years. Farm workers, most of whom are Mexican American in the Southwest, are excluded from the National Labor Relations Act, unlike other workers. Also, Mexican Americans often have to compete for low-paying jobs with their Mexican brothers from across the border who are willing to work for even less. Mexican Americans have to live with the stinging fact that the word Mexican is the synonym for inferior in many parts of the Southwest. That is why Mexican American activists flaunt the barrio word Chicano as an act of defiance and a badge of honor. Mexican Americans, though large in numbers, are politically impotent, or so politically impotent that in Los Angeles, where the country's largest concentration of Spanish-speaking people, they have no one of their own serving on the city council or the board of supervisors. So in other words, at the end of quote, he was a very eloquent journalist. And again, his columns were being read regularly across the country. And he was trying to make sense and acting almost like a go-between, as a broker between Chicanos and the larger community who was confused about what these young people wanted. And the key word in that column is defiance. Those of us who were involved in the movement saw ourselves as engaging in defiance against all of the rules and prescriptions that we had been subjected to and the continued oppression that we felt we experienced in this time period, in the schools, in the economy, and certainly, being drafted into the military because of a lack of opportunity.
Dr. Ortiz, in the documentary, we see a group of very young Latinos, Chicanos,
yes,
with a uniform, the brown berets.
Yes, the brown berets, yes.
What? Tell us about that group. Was it like a militia kind of group? What is about the brown beret?
So part of the Chicano movement involved what it was often described as militancy, aggressive, and so there were that was expressed symbolically. It wasn't expressed physically through violence. So it's expressed symbolically in terms of the, in this case of the brown berets, the uniforms that they had, modeled after the Black Panthers in the Black Power movement. Okay, and so the brown berets were one of many organizations that formed in this period. So this period is often called the era of Chicano cultural nationalism. Cultural nationalism is an ideology. It's an ideology that communities fall back on or embrace after they have tried working through the system and they have found themselves repeatedly rejected and continuing to face hostility. So what they do is they assume this ideology kind of as a defensive posture. And the way you see the ideology expressed are in terms of slogans like brown is beautiful or black is beautiful, and also in terms of clothing like that worn by the brown berets. So the brown berets were young people, and they often acted as a group that tried to protect, especially like in '68, the student protesters against abuse by police and others. They were very controversial because, as we saw, they appear to be very militant in terms of their appearance and their methods, but they were a peaceful organization. Again, they also advocated nonviolence. And so again, that's I think something to remember, and through all of this, is the Chicano movement was a nonviolent movement. The violence that occurred was on the part of police authorities. And so there come to be martyrs of the movement, Ruben Salazar being one of those martyrs. And we also know now, because of historical scholarship, that if violence happened to occur at a movement activity, it was likely caused by provocateurs. Just like today, during the summer, there were protests and we saw incidents of violence. One of the things you might have heard was that people alleging that it was possibly the work of provocateurs. In this period, provocateurs were quite common because the FBI had launched a program called the Counterintelligence Program aimed at surveilling all of these movements. And they infiltrated all the movements and had agents who deliberately attempted to create violence so as to discredit the movements.
Dr. Ortiz, you read in the column that you read from Salazar, which, by the way, is from El Paso, my hometown.
Yes, yes,
Texas
yes.
as well. He mentioned something there that is also perceived as a threat to Chicanos and Mexican Americans, and that is the cheap labor that he says our brothers from the South.
Yes. So
right. Was this part of the same situation than Cesar Chavez, one was accused of saying and being against undocumented immigrants and actually against the Bracero program?
The Bracero, yes.
All that?
Yeah, so the reference there was to the Bracero program. So the Bracero program had been established in World War II to meet a labor shortage that supposedly existed in the Southwest. And under that program, Mexican nationals, Mexicanos, were brought into this country to work in the fields. And so they were laborers who worked with their arms. And so hence the title Bracero. Brazo is the word for arm. And the program was continued after World War II, continued into the 50s and into the early 60s. And what we came to learn, again, from research done, was that the braceros were being used to prevent the organization of unions by American farm workers all throughout the Southwest. The braceros would be used as strike breakers. They would be paid less than American farm workers. And so that made it difficult for unions to organize. And so that's where that comes. And so in this period, Mexicanos are, seen in a light in which they're seen as being exploited, but they're also being seen as a threat. And they're a threat because of the way they're being used by growers throughout this period. So.
And also they had to work in most instances under sometimes inhumane conditions.
Yeah, so another scholar by the name of Ernesto Galarza wrote this study, did a study which he published as a book called Merchants of Labor, where he extensively documented the exploitation of the braceros. And that study was critical in convincing Congress in 1964 to end the bracero program because it was such a persuasive set of findings showing how brutal the exploitation was of braceros all throughout the country. And keep in mind that in this period, it's when Cesar Chavez sets out to organize a union of farm workers. And part of why he succeeds is because Congress terminates the bracero program. So that kind of provides an opening for actually now being able to effectively organize farm workers. So,
wonderful part of the history that we know very little about. What is the Chicano movement right now?
Some would say that the movement is still alive, but that it's not as organized as it was certainly in 1970. The high point of the movement was seen as 1975, and then it declines after 1975. And it declines in part because we saw the repression that occurs. But the activism continues. So for example, there was a shift from protests in the streets to electoral politics. So that's why today you can point to all those people serving in the legislature, because the focus goes to trying to get Congress to pass legislation that will protect the voting rights of Chicanos in the Southwest. And in 1975, Congress, in fact, does do that. It passes the Voting Rights Act of 75, and it authorizes the use of bilingual ballots in federal elections. And then, of course, subsequently, that becomes the practice in state elections. And so with that change, we began to see more and more Chicanos registering to vote and turning out to vote. And that begins to make an impact in terms of the level of representation. So we go from zero basically in 1970 to what we have today. what's at issue today is that despite the numbers, we're basically underrepresented in the system in California, given the size of the population in California. But so one of the things that what happened at the moratorium, the repression of the moratorium, is it led some activists to conclude that the streets were being closed off as an avenue of protest. That if we wanted to continue to protest, that it had to be done in other venues. So the electoral system became one of the areas. So in Texas first, and then in California, we also saw the creation of the first Chicano political party, the La Raza Unida Party.
And is it active still? Is it?
No, it lasted for about 5 years, but what happened was that the Democratic Party in particular responded to the rise of La Raza Unida Party and basically co-opted the issues that La Raza Unida Party had been setting forth, like bilingual education. Prior to this period, the Democratic Party had not embraced bilingual education. And so it does, it's part of its platform. It's in this period also that we see the rise of what we now celebrate as National Hispanic Heritage Month. It was begun by Lyndon Baines Johnson, who was president, and it was in response, one could say, to this discontent with the Democratic Party in that time period. Mexican Americans had been engaging in a series of protests against the Johnson administration for what they perceived to be its failure to respond to Mexican Americans. So one of the ways by which that response occurs is by this creation of Hispanic Heritage Week, and then it was extended into a month. Republican presidents began to also find ways of responding, if only symbolically, to the discontent. So for example, in 1970, Richard Nixon, by the name of Romana Bañuelos from Orange County, to be Treasurer of the United States. And so now if you have a dollar bill, look at it sometime, and in the left-hand corner, you'll see the signature. And I'd venture to say that more often than not, it'll be the signature of a Spanish surname woman, because what Nixon begins in 70 becomes precedent. And so just about every president that follows that, including Donald Trump, has appointed a Latina to be Treasurer of the United States. And it's again a way of communicating symbolically that you recognize that the population exists, communicating that it's important, and that you acknowledge that there should be some level of response or recognition of it. So,
besides that level of recognition, what parallels can we draw from August 29, 1970 and 50 years later?
The parallels are unfortunately sometimes negative in terms of the conditions that still persist. Those who organized the Chicano moratorium, the commemoration in August, have pointed out that, for example, many of the issues are still there, like the issue of police violence. Okay, if anything, maybe that has gotten worse over the last 50 years. In terms of schools, back then, one of the chief complaints was that Chicano students were segregated in the schools, and that in those schools, they were often limited in terms of their opportunities to access the college curriculum. That's still the case today. In fact, today, Chicano and Latino students are more segregated than ever. And the Education Trust West did a study 2 years ago where they found that many students are still being tracked as they were 50 years ago. We still have an underrepresentation of Latinos as teachers, as was the case back then. There's been improvement. For example, we no longer see Chicano students being punished physically for speaking Spanish on school grounds, as was the case back then. We've seen an improvement in the college going rate, but unfortunately, we still aren't at the level that we should be. So in California, at this point, only 18% of Latinos 25 and older have a college degree. So again, there's been some change, but there's also been continuity in some of the critical issues of that time period. Oh, the question is, how does the tracking occur in education? So tracking is a form of ability grouping. But what's different about most ability grouping is that what happens in this case is usually counselors, with the recommendations of teachers, beginning usually in junior high, but especially in high school, will put students into tracks. And historically, one of the tracks was the college prep track, and the student would thus take the classes that would qualify them for college. And then the other track was the vocational track. And those courses would involve things like shop and other kinds of vocational classes. So what the students in Los Angeles were protesting was that in the schools of Los Angeles, most of them were being tracked into the vocational curriculum, not given the choice as to which curriculum they would choose. And once you were placed in that track, it was a permanent placement. There was no getting out of it. So you would be denied then the opportunity to go to college. Counselors, in essence, were the gatekeepers, right? And so that still occurs today. The Education Trust tells us. So today, one of the things being done is to try to change the policies in school districts so that all students have access to the A through G curriculum, which is the curriculum that is needed to be eligible to apply to either the UC or the CSU system. Okay. Yes.
Yeah, we have a question from Marianne Berg. Does anyone know the percentage of Hispanic students at UC? I personally don't. I know all our UC campuses are recognized by the federal government as Latino Hispanic institutions, meaning that they have a certain percentage that is required of Latino students. I know Merced has a large number. I know Irvin has been recruiting a lot of students. Riverside just Latino students surpass other ethnic groups, but I don't have an exact number of that.
Let's see.
I just did a quick Google because I was interested, and I mean, it looks like there's an article from 2020, but it says EdSource. I don't know the source, but it just says that UC announced Thursday that's offered a record number of Latino students admission to its 9 undergraduate campuses for this fall. It's the third largest, the students now comprise UC's largest ethnic group of admitted freshmen, increasing from 34% to 36%.
Yes, that's the highest ever in terms of this. So, so you can see how it compares to the Education Trust West in their study 3 years ago. Reported that Latino students are underrepresented at all 3 branches of California's public higher education system. This is especially true in the UC system, where fewer than 1 in 3 students is Latino, despite Latino students comprising more than half of the high school graduating class. As the selectivity of the institution increases, so does the underrepresentation. At UC Berkeley, the most selective UC campus, only 14% of the fall 2016 freshman class was Latino, even though Latinos represent 51% of California's public high school graduates. So, so the numbers vary, but the term that still describes the situation is underrepresentation.
So
but
there's
again,
still a lot of work to do.
Yeah, so much work to do. Again, only 18% of Latinos aged 25 and over have a college degree at this point.
Wonderful. Randall Oliver, you have another question. Would you like to ask a question?
Well, I was just wondering about perspective. In our breakout group, we talked about the growing presence of Hispanic, Latino, Chicano among the police force officers. And, you know, I perceive that the tensions in the community are not what they were at one point in the past. And I'm wondering, is that perhaps the reason, or is my perception just off?
There's now representation in police forces. I can't tell you the exact percentage, but it's still probably a condition of underrepresentation. In some cases, I think it has led to better community relations, but I think it varies. And especially in the recent period with all the tension and turmoil. You know, so again, I think it varies from community to community. The police forces have made an effort to recruit, and so there's been some increase, but again, there's still, whether the relations are positive, negative, or wherever, vary from community to community. Yeah. But police violence as a whole is still regarded as a major issue because there continue to be shootings all throughout the state and certainly nationally. So.
It's also has been by some groups a big effort to have more Latino representation on federal organizations, policing organizations such as Border Patrol.
Yes. Yeah. So in the case of the Border Patrol, I think it's the Border Patrol. It's now some regarded as the largest police force in the country. And yes, one could say that Latinos are highly represented in the Border Patrol, which is seen not necessarily as a positive thing, given the incidents that have occurred involving brutality and violation of rights and so on. So in 1970, I think it could be said that there was this emphasis on trying to get the representation. Now, 50 years later, I think there's a more critical perspective that understands that simply because someone looks like that group does not necessarily mean more progressive policing, let's say, or more progressive educational policy. So again, there's been a kind of a reassessment and trying to rethink what does the representation, what is called descriptive representation, actually means.
So we can get so deep into that subject because it has been so many studies and all that.
Yeah.
We have another question from Norma de la Vega. It
Yeah.
says, how do you see the present and future of Latinos, and what do you like and what concerns you?
So there's a sociologist by the name of Marta Tienda who teaches at Princeton, and she has set forth the idea that we are living right now in what she calls the Hispanic moment. And what she means is that for the first time in the history of this country, Latinos have the numbers, the visibility, and the resources to play a major role in the future of the United States, and certainly here in California, because we have the state with the largest Latino population. But she also cautions that whether that occurs depends on what happens now in terms of investments in education, for example, in terms of employment and those things. And so I would like to be optimistic, but I also realize that there's still many challenges, many barriers that have to be overcome, especially, for example, in higher education. So think of this. So Dr. Guzman was the first Chicano to earn a PhD at UCLA, I think it was 1969. Today, across the country, 50 years later, people like myself who are faculty in colleges and universities, we make up only 2% of all the faculty in colleges and universities across the United States. It's a severe underrepresentation. And how are we going to significantly make a difference in that so that we'll see the representation that we need? It's still not clear. Will institutions respond to the growing population? It's clear now, as some put it, that demography is not destiny, that the numbers do not automatically translate into gains. And that in fact, at times, the few gains that have been made get pushed back. We see pushbacks, we see against those gains, as we've been seeing. We saw, for example, in the 90s, Proposition 187, Proposition 209, Proposition 227, all of whom were targeted at some of the gains that had been made back as a result of the social movements.
And, politically, one of those gains, Dr. Ortiz, will we consider one of those gains now that the Latino is not just part of a political party group, but has diversified and has found places in both political parties? Do we see that as a gain, or do we see that as a loss?
From a sort of political science objective standpoint, you could say that it's a gain in the sense that it's important to have representation in both parties. But depending upon where you stand from a party perspective, an ideological perspective, you could also see it as something that's a a negative development, especially if you look at the Republican Party in the most recent years. And so there's also some who say that, we need independent party efforts, and that there's enough dissatisfaction, certainly with both parties, that would help to explain why, for example, Bernie Sanders did so well in the Democratic primary here in California. He won the Democratic primary. Latinos, especially young Latinos, turned out extensively to support his candidacy, indicating, I think, that there's a need for alternatives, not the traditional, positions.
And since we're in the political arena, I have to ask you a question. Is it immigration the most seek after requisite or for voting for Latino families?
Is it what now?
Immigration.
Is
it one of the key factors for the Latinos
to
go out and vote for some candidate?
The factor that has been seen as helping to get people to turn out to vote is whether you have someone from that group actually running for office. And so the numbers, sometimes when we listen to all the numbers of Latinos in this country, we tend to forget sometimes that there are many who are undocumented and thus they're ineligible to vote. So the slogan that became very popular in the 80s, the slogan, "Su voto es su voz," it doesn't apply to people who are undocumented, right? And I've never liked the slogan because somehow it obscures that reality that there are people amongst us who have every right, they pay taxes and everything else, but yet they can't vote. And so that's something that has to be kept into account, and that's why there's so much emphasis in terms of trying to get immigration reform. What's really critical right now is the growing numbers of young people. It's said, I can't remember the exact data, but it said that every 30 seconds, a young Latino turns 18. And so that means this growing number of Latinos who will be eligible to vote, and who, will be able to exercise power. And the surveys that have been done this year tell us that young Latinos are very energized about the election. They're planning to vote, which is a good sign, especially since now the current generation Z and the most recent generation Y, they now make up the bulk of the Latino population. Those two generations alone basically provide the defining characteristics of Latinos in this country today, which is youthfulness.
What about states like Texas, Arizona, Nevada?
Well, Texas and Arizona
have a large number of Latinos as well.
Yes, and so there are some who say, some analysis that say that for the first time, both Texas and Arizona are in play in the presidential election. And Texas, for example, the race is close enough that Latino turnout could, in fact, lead to a Biden win in Texas, and the same in Arizona. And again, it's these growing numbers of young Latinos who don't necessarily, who aren't burdened by all the attitudes and beliefs and loyalties of the past, who are looking for something new, looking for something different other than the old tried remedies that have fallen short. So, and I think I have kind of a running debate with some members of my generation who are highly critical of the younger generation, saying, well, they're very self-centered, they don't vote, they feel entitled, and so on. So I find myself constantly trying to point out to them, well, that's a stereotype, much like we were stereotyped back in the day, as we heard in the documentary, as being inferiors, right? And so trying to point out to them that in 2018, if you look at the congressional election of 2018, young people actually turned out at higher rates than did the boomer generation. So things are changing, and we have to acknowledge those changes and not fall into the trap of criticizing the younger generations, and remind ourselves that we too were criticized. When we declared ourselves Chicanos, a lot of us caught hell. Basically, I had a tío who basically disowned me as part of his family because he thought I was a crazy, a youngster, by calling myself a Chicano and being out in the streets calling for Chicano power.
Well, that's a wonderful way to prove him wrong for what you have become, and to end this wonderful conversation. I want to thank you again. I can't thank you enough, Dr. Ortiz.
You're
for,
welcome. Yeah, thank you for inviting me. Yes.
invitation, for enlightening us about
Thank
that history of our country that some of us knew very little, and about the Chicano movement that some of us thought it was dead and still very much alive and kicking.
Yes, yes.
Thank you very much.
Thank
And
you.
to the rest of the participants, I just want to remind you, October 9th, next Friday, is the last one of the forums. And we have the guests of Latino journalists, farm workers, and human rights activists. They will share their experiences with the pandemic, the impact of COVID-19 in the Latino and indigenous communities, and why they think Latinos have been the ethnic group hit harder in the southern United States, and how we can work with them to help these families recover. And remember, it's 3 p.m. to 4:30 p.m. Thank you very much again for joining us, for supporting us, and for making these forums a real success. Thank you.
Thank you.
And have a wonderful evening, wonderful weekend. Bye-bye.
Bye.